My name is Birgit Schneider. I'm living in Germany, Berlin. I'm a cultural and media scholar researching in climate images and imaginaries in science and culture at the University of Potsdam. And the reason for the following interview is the pressing question of what we can do better or maybe even completely differently in climate change communication. And for this purpose, we invited several speakers from very different disciplines, but also different countries to talk about this subject. And my guest for this interview is Dr. Cornelia Auer, and she is a postdoc at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research and a project coordinator of the Census project, which will be important for this talk. And this project supports the understanding of a new generation of climate change scenarios. Welcome, Cornelia.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Schneider. Thanks for having me. I'm very curious on your questions.
I would like to start with the general idea of scenarios. We have had scenarios for a long time, for, I don't know, maybe 5 decades or longer, as a way to plan the future and also for ecology questions. And climate services, the idea of the climate services is to draw from the state of the art of climate science ideas to customize knowledge products to meet the need of specific stakeholders towards the goal of initiating and sustaining an appropriate action versus climate change. And so the interesting point for our conversation is you're not following the idea to communicate climate change in a better way, in a different way to the general public, but to stakeholders and to decision makers. And this is a very interesting point. And my first question, of course, to you is what are climate change scenario services in the Census toolkit that you offer together with your colleagues?
Thanks a lot for the question. So the unique approach about the climate change scenario service that we developed in the Census project with our colleagues was that we focus really to provide the great wealth of information that is given in climate change scenarios to a broader community of key stakeholders. So there have been climate services that focus on precipitation patterns or on temperature changes, but they were all more on narrow application areas and very focused on specific topics. And we see that there is also great interest from key stakeholders to understand these scenarios as a whole and not to only look at deduced indicators or values. What we see that this great interest can spark or can produce a concerted action towards climate stabilization, because with the help of these scenarios, the key stakeholders can make up a common understanding of the situation which we have at hand. And they can also do strategic planning, what needs to happen. And our service now focuses very much on making these scenarios more salient to these users. They are academic products, and they are perceived as rather complex objects. And the Census Toolkit, which is the outcome of our Census project, really focuses on providing these users access to the entire, not the entire wealth, but to the broad wealth that is in these scenarios.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And why would you say that we need such a thing as the climate change scenarios? What do they offer, what we cannot gain in another way?
Mm-hmm. What they do offer is that they help us to cope with uncertainty. So we will not know what the future will look like because there will be political decisions which we can't foresee. And very prominent example at the moment is if the United States have a Biden administration, the future will look very different as it would look if we have 4 more years of a Trump administration. This is something that we cannot foresee. Also, we cannot foresee the individual political decisions. We can also not foresee how society will, like on a global level, but also on a national level, how they will react to the transformations that have to be achieved, but also how they will react on the impacts of climate change. And then there are also technical aspects like innovations, etc. And scenarios provide consistent narratives. And these consistent narratives about potential futures go through these uncertain aspects, and they allow us to kind of work ourselves off with these objects and to understand what if this happens, how can we react? So the future is, or key levers are uncertain, but it's still inherently not completely unknown. And they help us to prepare for an uncertain future.
Mm-hmm. And this idea of projecting the future and finding maybe pathways into an unknown, uncertain future by finding the certainties about it. How did this take place? So who are the storytellers or the world makers of your model? What stories are included?
What stories? So we were working mostly with the scenarios that appear in the IPCC reports. And to some extent, there is co-production happening on the important questions that need to be addressed. But for the consistent narratives, it's really a solid scientific basis. So it's really evaluating changes that had happened in the past and how people or how economies react to certain transitions. And they go, like for mitigation scenarios now, and they go into the expression of the future pathways. But the topics that are addressed are partially also co-produced with stakeholders from policy and now also increasingly from economy and from the finance sector.
Mm-hmm. So who are the stakeholders you are aiming at? You already mentioned some of them. And maybe you can also give an example because you already did some workshops in different countries.
Yeah, so the stakeholders the census project aimed at was policy actors on a global, but also on a national level. Like on a global level, it would be really a lot about the transformation pathways in order to provide solutions towards a low carbon economy. With the national policy actors, this focuses more on adaptation measures. We had stakeholders in Kenya that were looking into transnational threats by climate change, so food production, etc. But we also had stakeholders in the Netherlands, where they also investigated the tension that can show up between adaptation to climate change, but also mitigation. So if you have to build a dike, you cannot put a windmill there. So at some stage now, we are still in theory. At some stage, the individual measures will also get into attention what can be done. Mm-hmm. And then the other important group of stakeholders we had was global financial actors. They had a very great interest because up to now they were only working on the basis of past data. So for their risk assessments, they were looking at data from the past, but they are now facing an unprecedented situation that they have to prepare for climate change. And they identified scenarios as one gateway to prepare, and there was huge interest. So we had stakeholders from the IFC, from the World Bank, but also from the Bundesbank. And a side project, the NGFS project, is also now working with the NGFS. This is a global network of central banks all over the globe. And of course, this is a huge momentum that builds up and that we want to serve in the sense of a service with our toolkit. And of course, one is never finished, but I think the nature of the toolkit helped these stakeholders a lot because we provide staged access. So even though we are not producing information for the common public, and it requires some preparation and some pre-knowledge, we still provide high-level entry points where, for example, executive personnel that is under strong time pressure, etc., they can get a concise overview of the most important contexts, and then they can go into detail at a second step. And I think this was really helpful for them, that we really focused on clicking the communication and not having a common problem that science is telling something, but the users are talking about a different universe, and that communication often does not click perfectly, and we don't click perfectly either, but we really made a great effort, and I think we made it click a bit more.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I would like to, we will talk about the co-production side in a minute. I would like to ask about the time and the space of your scenario. So what is the scale of the scenario? So if I was a city, let's say somewhere in the Netherlands or in Kenya, could I come to you and say, would you please give us a workshop, and could you bring it down to my scale, your scenarios? And how would you do that?
Mm-hmm. So I would say if you were a city and you approached us, we would not be able to instantly provide you with scenarios backed up by the complete databases. But we could, of course, convene and then work with you on potential futures for your city. For example, there are the SSPs. They are the shared socioeconomic pathways. They show extreme directions that humanity can take. And one extreme would be a future that is ruled by humanity, by well-being, by nature protection, etc. And an opposite scenario would be where the corporation has a very little influence and it's very nationalist, etc. And so if you want to prepare a future for yourself, we could start with these socioeconomic scenarios and say, what do you want your city to look like in 20 years? And what would it look like if we have a setup that is based on cooperation and on well-being? Or what would it be if we have a setup that is based on own interest and let's say maximization of profits? And like this, you could really start a visionary process at the beginning. So, okay, which directions could my city go in general? And then, of course, we can provide you with detailed technical information or also, but I think this is something that can only be more inspirational because our scenarios are in a global level and they go until 2100.
So when you engage in these workshops, what is the time frame your stakeholders are interested in? Do they look at the next 20 years only, or what is the time frame of thinking when you enter scenario thinking in your case?
Yeah, this is an important point because it makes the applicability of our scenarios at first sight limited. Of course, policy stakeholders, they are interested in a long time horizon because the damages, they play out today, but they will play out even stronger in mid until further future. But also for our finance stakeholders, if you have central banks and if you have institutional investors, they are interested. Of course, their traditional time horizon is at maximum 5 years. So there is a huge mismatch. But I think to some extent they have learned to cope with it because there is no alternative yet. And on the other hand, we are really working on the near-term realism of our scenarios in order to be able to provide relevant information for these actors. But it is a challenge, of course, that has to be addressed and that is addressed.
Normally, stories have an actor. And who are the actors in your stories? Is it economic growth? Is it people? Is it politicians, nations, bank communities? Or is it maybe the emissions which act in your story?
At first sight, of course, we can make up two big actors. And one actor is like the socioeconomic actor or humanity from a socioeconomic perspective. And the other big actor is the climate system. And these interactions are the main actors of our scenarios. And then if we go into detail, I really like this question. And then if we go into detail, then of course the socioeconomic actors, if you look at the mitigation scenarios that we have, then of course economy is an important element. They are really very practical. I mean, there are climate scenarios that are visionary or dark scenarios, but like the integrated assessment scenarios are really very practical in order to achieve the transformation. And they are also very realistic. So economy is one central part. And there's, of course, humanity and elements like the sustainable development goals for more for a better development and for more distribution. They also play an increasing part and role there, which is really good and important. You can imagine if we're on a global level, until 2100, we don't have the agency of individual actors or something like Fridays for Future, dynamics like this, they don't show up here. It's more economic reasoning and mostly trying to avoid free riders in order not to provide scenarios that speak to the converted, but will invite people that are not interested in climate protection just to do the converted their job, let them do their job and then just not be part of the transformation. So our actors are very classic, I would say, but it's opening up. And I think aspects like well-being or any aspect that is covered by the SDGs are taking more and more a prominent role in these scenarios.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And now that you mentioned it, did you also invite stakeholders who are not at all interested in climate change adaptation or maybe even deny climate change? Or would you see a chance because of scenarios to make these people experience climate change as a threat in a different way?
Mm. So we didn't do it because we were, like, our focus was really more from the perspective, okay, 2020 has to be the game changer year. We need to make this information accessible. But of course, it would be a very interesting approach to invite climate change deniers or skeptics. It also addresses a lot that was one of my main reasoning about the project, that we really need to co-produce the information more together and not only communicate if you look at the Latin root, then it has something of together. And we should really also answer the question of people that are not convinced yet or that are skeptics. So Ottmar Edenhofer likes to mention that we need to do unexpected alliances. So not the same people coming together over and over again, but to really, align with others and to create an even greater momentum and to really discuss on a very equal level and explain and provide information. So this would be really an interesting option for sure.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about visualization and the role of images for the toolkit. Maybe on two levels. How do you show the uncertainties? Is there a visualization you have for uncertainties? Because it's about risk assessment, it's about projecting the future, and of course it's not about prophecy here. And how do you include the uncertainties, and what role do images play for this communication in general in the toolkit?
So uncertainty was a big surprise for us because our stakeholders didn't ask for it, although that had been a tradition the years before. But we tackled uncertainty for climate change impact, for example, that users can explore the output, the different output of models on their own and get a feeling for the uncertainty in the data. But we also try to provide a synthesis on the uncertainty, but we didn't focus as much on uncertainty visualization. And for the mitigation scenarios, we came up with a really great and novel approach that is not based so much on visualization, but with working together with our stakeholders, they asked us that not we should judge the uncertainty for them, but what we did was that we provided them a search interface where they could search for scenarios that would be aligned with their assumptions. So if you have a stakeholder who says, I totally believe in solar energy, then this stakeholder can search for scenarios that have a high share on solar. And like this, they could work along the narratives of these scenarios or negative emissions, etc. These are highly controversial topics and we cannot solve it for the stakeholders. So we allow the stakeholders to make the decisions themselves and to identify scenarios in the search interface. And very nice aspect of the search interface was that Jonas Parner, who did it, he incorporated histograms, like how frequent such scenarios would be. So the user still can do his own decision or her own decision, but she would still see the frequency of her decision. So if that was a very unusual scenario, or if it was a scenario that would agree with the majority of the others.
Mm-hmm. And I could imagine that many people, the more people who use the scenario toolkit, so you might end up in so many scenarios, and I'm just asking myself, how standardized do scenarios have to be in the long run? So if we have like 16 scenarios and one is going for solar energy, the other one is going for geoengineering, I don't know. How does this fit together?
Mm-hmm. I think there needs to be a great effort. This is something that I see really crucial because there is especially for future like adaptation measures or mitigation measures, there's a broad variety of scenarios and it is nearly impossible for a user to judge or a standard, that there is no standard. And I think we cope with that at the moment that we offer co-production workshops and tutorials. So we take the users at the hand and still we have the toolkit as a basis, and we already saw that it can spark fantastic discussions, even though at some stage the visualizations, when we go more into the data, might appear a bit abstract. It really turned out that their great discussions would start from there. So we cope a bit with it via cooperation and tutorials. But of course, this is something that the community has to solve in the future, because I think it will on the long run hinder the more comprehensive uptake of the data and information that we have.
And you say that the idea and the method of co-production is so important. This is something that you have at the very heart of your project, this idea of co-production. And you already mentioned that by co-producing information, you enrich the models, or is it, on what level does this co-production take place?
Yeah, so I read a really interesting book at the start of the project, and it was actually from Hasso-Plattner, also in Potsdam, and it was about design thinking. And one sentence that really struck me was that they said, it must be about not that science delivers answers to questions, but that we identify the right questions and from there go to the correct answers. And I don't know if I could express that now clearly, but the great value of co-production is that it helps you to ask the right questions and that you manage to click science and users. And if you ask questions, if you always do your science, then you have a certain perspective and you enrich that perspective, but more in a certain direction, in an academic direction. The moment a user from outside comes and asks a different question, which might have more context and more complex background, you have to rethink your science. And maybe you even have data ready. It could be that you need to recompile it. And all of a sudden, this is something that we really saw in the visualization and in the co-production process. All of a sudden, you show data and everybody is surprised how this data looks like from that perspective. So it induces a perspective switch, and it also produces the need that the scientists need to either produce new data or to recompile their data. And then this is what I mean with it adds a value to it, because it, at the one hand, it becomes more usable, more relevant to the users, but at the same time, it undergoes a validation process. Does my science work also from a different perspective? And I mean, there is no tragedy, of course, they can adapt it, but it has to be done. And I think there is a huge value in pursuing that.
The idea that it's so important in our days to learn system thinking, and I think this is learning about to think in scenarios is also learning how to think systems and how they interact. What do you think? When should people start learning this? Is this something they start on the level of the decision-making process or in their late careers after having studied? Or is it something maybe people should already learn in school, for example, by cardboard games such as, I think it was also produced by your institute, the Keep Cool game. It's a cardboard game where you can strategically plan into the future and play a future. So what do you think about this general idea of it's important to learn system thinking today?
It's a wonderful idea, actually. And now that you ask me, I would say, of course, if possible, it should be learned at school, because it helps to go out of your personal circle that you have, but you look at it from above. And it also takes out emotions and fears and personal circumstances, but it allows you to take a rather neutral perspective and to cooperate, to co-produce on that basis. I think there is a great chance in systems thinking, and it also allows to look into the future, also to look from a systematic perspective in the past and to really derive solutions that are not just repeating history with the small nuances of change. But I think we need a fundamental change, and therefore systems thinking is like one of the big levers that we can take. There's also, what was her name? Donna?
It's not Donna Meadows, is it?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think there's a great chance. So if we had a chance to start with systems thinking at school, I think our future has a greater chance.
Could you also imagine the scenario toolkit to be used by very different people? So if I understood it correctly, at the moment it's used by stakeholders who in a way are in power of something. Mm-hmm. What if indigenous people, or I don't know, people who are not in power, how would they use this toolkit?
I think it would be to some extent the same than with the people of power. They would need some support from our side. They would need also tutorials and direct interaction in order to understand the information that we provide there. So to some extent, it would just be equal. And then I think they could certainly take a lot of information with them, because there are the potential pathways that we can go, that we show. And then we also have one element where you really see how our future will transform and how we will go from fossil fuels to electricity. So this could be like not for an indigenous group, but maybe for young pupils or students, they could understand the future that they are facing. And then we have these impact visualizations where actually indigenous groups could take a look what their future might look like for different warming levels in their area where they live, and how they are exposed to drought or to other extreme events, and be informed, and from that information gather some power. Mm-hmm. But maybe it's also, I think, if you allow me, I think there's also another important aspect that revealed itself in the course of the project. What is also extremely important for the communication that we provide is that it connects. That we stop producing islands of information where a user jumps in and has to switch her context and needs to dive into that context of the information we provide, but that we rather need to connect to other information that is already established, and that we build bridges from there, and that we allow users to have a landscape and allow them to wander around instead of having to jump from one island to the next island.
Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for sharing your thoughts with us and the idea of the Scenario Census Toolkit.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you so much for your super interesting questions. It was really inspiring to talk to you.